Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a military operation that sounds like something out of ancient history, really.
Yeah.
You know, a clever deception, a surprise attack from within,
Right.
but using the absolute latest tech.
Hmm.
And the outcome? Billions with a B. Billions of dollars in damage deep behind enemy lines,
Yeah.
caused by a swarm of drones that, well, individually costs less than most cars. It honestly sounds impossible when you first hear it.
It absolutely challenges conventional military thinking. I mean, especially when you think about the distances involved and the level of penetration they actually achieved. It's quite remarkable.
That's exactly what we're diving into today. The event is Operation Spiderweb, carried out back on June 1st, 2025. And our deep dive is based on this detailed report that explores, well, everything about it, where it came from, how they pulled it off, what it all means, and even how it stacks up against moments from history.
Right. So our mission today, essentially, is to go through the source material, pull out the crucial details of this unprecedented event, understand the tactics, maybe the brilliance behind it.
Yeah, the tactical genius.
Look at those historical parallels the report draws, which are quite interesting. Analyze the implications, which are, frankly, huge. And then, figure out what this one operation tells us about where warfare might be heading.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Starting with the source material on the basic anatomy of Operation Spiderweb. What actually happened on June 1st?
Okay, so the report lays out the core details very clearly. It took place June 1st, 2025, targeting 5 major Russian air bases simultaneously.
Simultaneously, wow.
Yeah, and these weren't bases near the front lines, not at all. We're talking about locations spread across just immense distances. You've got Belaya in Siberia.
Siberia.
Yep. Diaghilevo and Ivanovo-Severny in central Russia. Alenia way up near the Arctic Circle in Murmansk, and Ukrainka out in the Russian Far East.
That geographical spread alone is just astonishing for a single coordinated strike. And the scale of the damage, the source says it was devastating.
Oh, absolutely. The report states 41 Russian military aircraft were destroyed or significantly damaged, and it specifically calls out at least 12 Tu-95 strategic bombers.
Those are the big ones, right? The iconic long-range bomber.
Exactly. Those, plus radar aircraft, refueling tankers, a real mix of high-value assets, and the estimated price tag for all that destruction. Over $7 billion.
$7 billion in damage. Okay, and this is where it gets really wild for me. What weapon system caused that? Must have been advanced long-range missiles, right? Cruise missiles.
Well, that's the kicker. That's the key twist here. According to the source, the entire attack was conducted using just 117 first-person view drones. FPV drones.
FPV drones, like the ones hobbyists use, but weaponized.
Essentially, yeah. But these weren't, multi-million-dollar Predators or Reapers. The source estimates the cost per drone was somewhere around $30,000.
Wait, hold on. $30,000 per drone. So maybe $3.5 million total for the drones.
Roughly.
Caused over $7 billion in damage. That ratio seems almost unbelievable.
The numbers from the report suggest exactly that. It's staggering. But the how they actually did it, that's maybe even more fascinating. How did they get these relatively simple, cheap drones deep inside Russia to 5, presumably heavily guarded, strategic air bases?
Okay, yeah. That's the big question. How did they do it?
So the source describes a method that sounds, well, like something straight out of a spy thriller. The drones were reportedly smuggled inside fake wooden cabins, like prefabricated structure.
Wooden cabins?
Yeah. These cabins were then loaded onto ordinary trucks. And here's the incredible part, driven by unwitting Russian civilian contractors.
Wait. Unwitting.
Yeah.
The truck drivers had no idea they were hauling attack drones.
That's what the report claims, yes. They were just civilian logistics guys moving what looked like normal cargo, prefab cabins, maybe for construction sites or something, who knows.
Okay.
The drones were hidden inside these structures, basically blending into the everyday flow of goods moving around deep inside Russia.
So they just drove them to or near the bases?
Apparently. Once the trucks reached locations near the target air bases, the report suggests sometimes right outside the perimeter fences, the drones were then activated remotely by operators located back inside Ukraine.
So the attack force literally hitched a ride on civilian trucks, driven by people who had no clue, deep into the heart of Russian territory.
Yeah.
That's mind-blowing. What was the overall strategic impact of pulling something like that off?
Well, the report points to several critical outcomes. First, it was by far the largest Ukrainian drone strike of the war up to that point. Definitely the deepest, and the first time they'd hit so many strategic targets simultaneously across such vast distances.
Right.
But strategically, maybe the biggest impact was just how badly it exposed Russia's vulnerabilities.
Hmm.
It basically screamed that their domestic air defenses, their intelligence services, their internal security, they were just incapable of detecting or stopping this kind of infiltration and attack. A massive failure.
Okay, that lays out the core event pretty clearly. And that description, smuggling them inside fake structures, it feels like it leads directly into one of the historical comparisons the source makes.
It absolutely does. The report leans heavily into the Trojan horse comparison. And it's a really compelling parallel when you break it down.
Tell me more about that. How does Operation Spiderweb actually echo that ancient Greek tactic?
Well, think about the original story, right? The Greeks couldn't breach Troy's walls directly, so they built this giant wooden horse, hid soldiers inside.
And presented as a gift or an offering.
Exactly, something seemingly harmless, or at least non-threatening, that the Trojans themselves willingly brought inside their supposedly secure city walls.
Okay.
Now look at Spiderweb. Ukraine couldn't easily strike these deep bases conventionally. Flying drones that far over hostile defended airspace is incredibly hard. So they concealed their soldiers, the FPV drones, inside these fake wooden cabins.
Which looked like ordinary cargo.
Right. Transported by ordinary civilian trucks. So just like the horse entered Troy under false pretenses, these cabins, appearing as just regular stuff being moved around, penetrated deep into Russian territory using Russia's own civilian logistics system. Minimal suspicion raised.
Gaining entry through deception, basically.
Precisely. And then comes the surprise attack from within the territory that was thought to be safe.
Ah, okay. I see the parallel now.
Just like the Greek soldiers jumped out once the horse was inside Troy's walls, in Spiderweb, the drones were launched remotely only after being deployed and hidden deep within Russia's logistical network, close to their targets. So effectively, the attack came from inside what Russia considered its secure rear area.
It's more than just a neat historical comparison, though, isn't it? The source seems to suggest this highlights something fundamental about warfare itself.
It really does. The report uses this parallel to underscore that these ancient principles, psychological warfare, misdirection, deception, cleverly leveraging logistics, even mundane civilian logistics, they remain incredibly powerful. Still incredibly relevant in the 21st century, maybe even more so when combined with modern tech.
Okay. Now, the report also brings up another major historical comparison, one that speaks more to the a strategic shock of this whole thing.
Yes, that's right. The source points out that some military analysts are actually comparing Operation Spiderweb to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Pearl Harbor, that's a huge comparison.
It is, and it's really crucial to clarify. As the source does, this comparison isn't about casualties. Operation Spiderweb, remarkably, seems to have resulted in no human casualties directly from the drone strikes themselves.
Right.
The comparison is about the strategic impact, the element of surprise, the scale of the blow against a critical military capability, and its potential to fundamentally reshape the course of a conflict or elude military thinking and doctrine.
Okay, so what are the specific parallels the report is drawing there?
Well, Pearl Harbor, obviously, was Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. It shattered American assumptions and dragged the U.S. into World War II, changing its entire course. Operation Spiderweb was Ukraine's surprise drone blitz on Russia's long-range strategic bomber fleet. The source suggests that, like Pearl Harbor, it could potentially shift the course of modern drone warfare, maybe force changes in NATO's defense posture, and it could certainly provoke significant Russian retaliation or maybe even a major doctrinal shift within their military, similar kinds of strategic reverberations.
And hitting those Pacific planes, the 295s, on their home bases thousands of miles from the fighting. Why is damaging that fleet specifically so significant, according to the source?
The report really emphasizes this point. The 295 fleet isn't just any aircraft. It's a core part of Russia's strategic bomber force. It's a key element of their nuclear deterrence triad.
Ah, so it hits their nuclear posture.
It hits both the capability and the perception. Successfully striking these high-value assets so deep inside Russia, it undermines their practical ability to deliver long-range conventional strikes, yes. But maybe even more importantly, it chips away at the perception of Russian power and the supposed invulnerability of its most vital strategic assets. It's a symbolic blow just as much as a practical one.
Okay, so we've got the operation itself, the sort of tactical genius behind it, and this immense strategic shock. What about the ripple effects? What were the immediate consequences and maybe the broader implications, especially for Russia and for Europe?
Well, for Russia, the immediate military impact was clearly significant. Losing that many operational long-range bombers, I mean, planes like the Tu-95 are strategic assets. They take years, potentially decades, to design, build, and replace.
Not something you can just order more of quickly.
Not at all. The source notes this loss is not easily recoverable, especially under sanctions. But beyond the physical loss, there's the psychological blow. The sheer fact that these deep, supposedly secure bases could be hit like this must have absolutely shattered confidence within Russia about their own domestic security.
And the source mentioned something about a response in the cyber and electronic warfare domain. That happened pretty quickly.
Apparently so, yes. Following the operation, there were widespread reports picked up by aviation monitors and NATO of massive GPS jamming, particularly affecting airspace over the Baltic Sea and in Nordic countries.
Affecting civilian flights, NATO planes.
Both, it seems, causing navigation problems for commercial airliners, but also reportedly impacting NATO surveillance and patrol aircraft operating near the Russian border, places like Poland and Lithuania. And the report also details what it calls a noticeable increase in Russian hybrid warfare activities across Europe around that time. Things like intensified disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks aimed at critical European infrastructure power grids, communication networks, and more jamming of maritime and aviation signals generally.
Okay, so that raises a huge question, which the source tackles directly. Is Russia actually going to retaliate militarily against Europe itself because of this?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? The source's analysis suggests that a direct, conventional military attack on a NATO country remains probably unlikely, mostly because of Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause. The risks for Russia would be immense.
Right. Attacking NATO is a different ballgame.
Completely. However, the report outlines several other, perhaps more plausible and maybe more insidious forms of retaliation that were either already being observed or were strongly anticipated.
Such as? What kind of things?
Well, things like ramping up cyber sabotage against European targets, maybe using paramilitary groups, Wagner-style proxies, to stir up trouble or instability in countries bordering Russia, think Moldova, Georgia, maybe even the Baltic states.
Destabilization efforts.
Exactly. And of course, the most direct route, simply intensifying strategic missile and drone strikes inside Ukraine itself, hitting harder there. The report also suggests Russia might escalate its rhetoric, maybe more nuclear saber-rattling, partly as a way to offset the embarrassment and strategic setback from Spiderweb without risking that direct NATO confrontation.
So a response definitely expected, maybe already happening, but likely concentrated in those gray zones, cyber hybrid warfare, proxies, or just a much harsher campaign within Ukraine rather than a direct military clash with NATO members.
That seems to be the assessment presented in the source, yeah. Now, stepping back a bit, the source also really emphasizes that Operation Spiderweb isn't just another incident in the war. It sees it as a crucial marker, maybe even proof, of a real paradigm shift happening in 21st century conflict.
A paradigm shift. How does the source explain that? What's changing so fundamentally?
It basically contrasts the old ways of war with what Spiderweb demonstrated. Traditionally, military power was often measured by big, expensive, complex platforms, heavy bombers, main battle tanks, aircraft carriers.
Right, the expensive hardware.
Spiderweb shows cheap, scalable, maybe even semi-autonomous drone swarms achieving massive results against those very platforms. Traditional warfare involved high human risk, huge political fallout from casualties. This kind of drone operation, as seen here, is remote. It's potentially deniable, at least initially, and it minimizes the direct human risk for the attackers.
And what about how military operations are structured?
Well, traditional military forces often rely on these big top-down hierarchical command structures, something like Spiderweb, especially with that distributed smuggled deployment method. It implies much more agile, maybe small team planning and execution were key. Decentralized. And maybe the most critical point, traditional defense focused heavily on fortifying fixed bases, borders, infrastructure. Spiderweb seems to show that in this new era, if you can infiltrate effectively, then pretty much anywhere can become a target, regardless of how heavily fortified it might look according to old metrics. Distance doesn't grant immunity anymore.
And that cost-to-damage ratio we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
that $3.5 million in drones taking out $7 billion in assets, that must be absolutely central to this paradigm shift idea.
Oh, completely central. The source explicitly points out that ratio nearly a 2,000 to 1 return on offensive investment. Just think about that number. It forces every military planner, every defense ministry, every government worldwide to fundamentally rethink their budget priorities.
Why spend billions on a next-gen fighter or bomber if?
Exactly. If a tiny fraction of that cost, invested in sophisticated drone swarms and clever deployment methods, can potentially neutralize it on the ground before it even takes off, it completely flips the script on military spending and strategy.
Okay, so this massive event happens, this huge upset. How did the rest of the world react? The source covers the global reactions, right?
It does, yeah. According to the report, the United States was, frankly, caught off guard. Ukraine apparently didn't give advance notice to either the U.S. or NATO about the operation.
Really, no heads up.
That's what the source claims. And while the U.S. public stance was cautious, urging restraint, the report suggests that privately, U.S. officials were likely impressed by the operational audacity and effectiveness, but also deeply concerned about the risks of uncontrolled escalation and maybe a loss of control over the conflict's narrative.
Okay, what about Europe? Closer to the action.
Europe definitely went on heightened alert, especially, as we mentioned, in the Baltic and Nordic regions, which experienced that immediate GPS jamming fallout. There was apparently immediate discussion across European defense circles about the urgent need to invest way more and faster in counter-drone systems, electronic warfare capabilities, that kind of thing.
And particularly worrying for the newer NATO members.
Yes, the source mentions countries like Finland and Sweden, given their long borders with Russia, were reportedly particularly concerned. This hit close to home, literally.
And China. What was their takeaway, according to the source?
China is described as watching very, very closely. The source suggests that Operation Spiderweb might be seen by Beijing as a potential blueprint, or at least offering inspiration, for scenarios they might consider like a future conflict in the Taiwan Strait.
How so?
Well, it reinforces this idea that low-cost, high-frequency swarm warfare using deception and infiltration could be incredibly effective against a larger, more technologically advanced, but perhaps more conventional adversaries' forces, a potential asymmetric advantage.
Okay, so beyond just the immediate reactions, what are the big strategic lessons? The takeaway is that the source says every military, every security agency should be learning from this single operation.
The report distills it down to 4 key lessons. Lesson 1, it says, the front line is everywhere. Geographical distance, physical borders, they just don't offer sanctuary anymore in the age of advanced drone warfare and clever infiltration. Assets thousands of miles from any conventional front line are now demonstrably vulnerable.
So you just can't assume your deep strategic bases are inherently safe anymore.
That assumption looks pretty shaky now, yeah. Lesson 2. Air bases are now digital battlefields. Legacy air defense systems, physical security protocols. They were designed for older threats, like bombers or cruise missiles coming over the horizon. They proved vulnerable to these modern, low-signature drones, especially when combined with unconventional deployment like smuggling. The battle isn't just stopping things flying in. It's about stopping them getting past the digital and physical perimeter using deception on the ground.
Right, it's an intelligence and infiltration challenge, too. Which leads to lesson 3.
Exactly. Lesson 3. Intelligence superiority trumps pure firepower. The source argues the success of Spiderweb wasn't just about the drones themselves, cool as they were. It was fundamentally enabled by elite intelligence, knowing the targets, the routines, the vulnerabilities, by the ability to infiltrate deep into enemy territory, likely needing human agents or sympathizers, and by the successful deception plan. Knowing where and how to place those drones was actually more critical than the individual capability of any single drone.
Makes sense. And the final lesson.
Lesson 4. Lesson 4. Security theater is dead. That's the provocative phrase the source uses. It argues that Russia's huge, incredibly expensive military apparatus, built over decades to defend against large-scale conventional or nuclear attack, was effectively bypassed, even paralyzed, by just 117 relatively cheap, almost DIY-style drones smuggled in trucks. It highlights this potentially massive gap between perceived security based on old doctrines and impressive-looking hardware and the actual real-world vulnerability to these new, asymmetric, technologically enabled methods. What looks secure might just be theater.
Those are incredibly powerful lessons. So putting it all together, where does this leave us? What does the source predict happens next, both short-term and long-term, based on this event?
Okay, short-term forecasts from the source include, well, Almost certainly. A significant intensification of Russian missile and drone strikes inside Ukraine as direct retaliation for the embarrassment and losses.
Making Ukraine pay the price.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
For Europe, the prediction is those heightened hybrid warfare threats, the cyber attacks, the jamming, the disinformation, will likely continue and maybe even increase. And for NATO, it's expected they'll almost certainly accelerate the development and deployment of counter-drone technologies, advanced cyber defenses, and maybe rethink base security protocols across the alliance.
And looking further down the road, what are the long-term implications considered in the report?
Long term, the source suggests a few possibilities. One is that Russia might try to launch its own accelerated drone arms race to try and close this capability gap that Spiderweb so brutally exposed. Whether they can, given sanctions and tech access, is another question. More broadly, the prediction is that military doctrines worldwide are going to have to shift, probably significantly, towards integrating low-cost, high-frequency, maybe autonomous or semi-autonomous warfare, recognizing the sheer disruptive potential demonstrated here.
And then there's that really provocative point the source makes, the one about civilian infrastructure potentially becoming a battleground.
Yeah, that's a chilling one. The report highlights the potential implication that civilian supply chains, things like trucking networks, maybe rail, shipping, could become new arenas for conflict. Not just for secretly delivering weapons through infiltration, as seen here, but potentially for widespread surveillance or sabotage or disruption in future conflicts.
Why? Because they're so pervasive and hard to monitor?
Exactly, because they penetrate deep into a nation's interior, they rely on civilian operators, and they're incredibly difficult to secure completely without crippling your own economy. It opens up a whole new vector for asymmetric attacks.
Wow. Okay. So wrapping this deep dive up then, Operation Spiderweb is presented in this source not just as a battle, but as a genuine watershed moment in military history.
It really is portrayed that way, an event that kind of blends ancient, almost timeless tactics of deception and strategic surprise on a scale that gets compared to Pearl Harbor, but executed using truly bleeding-edge 21st century technology like AI-assisted FPV drones and remote coordinated operations.
And the source concludes it wasn't just a tactical victory for Ukraine, maybe not even just strategic, but a global wake-up call.
Absolutely. The argument is the damage isn't just the physical destruction of $7 billion worth of aircraft. It's also the damage inflicted on the enemy's perception of their own security, maybe their own power. It forces a potentially fundamental reevaluation of military doctrine, defense spending, and it creates this new level of fear about vulnerabilities that perhaps were previously unthinkable or dismissed.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a final, pretty provocative thought, really, based on everything we've just pulled from this source material. If, as the report suggests, ordinary civilian infrastructure like trucking can be weaponized for infiltration, and if geographical distance truly no longer provides sanctuary, meaning effectively anywhere can be a target, how does the very definition of security need to change? Not just for governments and militaries building defenses, but for you personally, for corporations. What does that idea really mean in your world, day to day?
It's a deep question, and it's one this operation, according to the source, forces everyone to start confronting as these new forms of conflict become more prevalent and maybe more accessible.
Absolutely. A lot to think about there. Thank you for diving deep into this fascinating and maybe, slightly unsettling topic with us today.